Welcome back to the final week of Stormi Tells Ghost Stories Haunted Charleston on my Girls Walk Projections channel. In this video, I'll be talking about 3 more haunted locations in this charming little port city: the Pink House, Poogan's Porch, and White Point Garden. We're going to start with an art and jewelry gallery that used to be right in the middle of Charleston's former red light district. The Pink House, which should not be confused with the Pink House in Savannah. When visiting Charleston, it's hard to miss the 3-story, brightly colored home at 17 Chalmers Street. The second oldest home in South Carolina's Holy City, the aptly named Pink House, was built by John Breton in Charleston's French Quarter. Over the years, this building has been the center of countless stories, and it has been used as a tavern and brothel, a law office, a private home, and, most recently, an art gallery. Today, the Pink House is more commonly known for an Instagram-worthy backdrop, but only a few know of its dark underbelly and haunted history. Locals often tell of a strange, wispy figure that's said to pace back and forth on the 3rd floor. Others claim that the Pink House is haunted by the ghost of an infamous female pirate. Regardless of which souls roam the Pink House from beyond the grave, there's no denying that these grounds are, in fact, a sort of hub for otherworldly activity. With bordellos and taverns accounting for many of the most haunted places in the world, it's not surprising that Charleston's Pink House hides a secret, sordid past, one that continues to resurrect itself after the sun goes down. The Pink House looks nearly the same as it did when it was first constructed in 1712, though some people push that it was constructed back in the 1690s. With its original terracotta roof, its blush pink color, and, well, its recognizable, adorable, and quaint vibe, many are unaware of its dark and turbulent past. At the start, Chalmers Street was nothing but mud, which naturally became a problem when the city flooded. Soon, there was a realization that all of the ballast stones which had been placed in the ships and therefore thrown into the harbor as they were deemed useless, found a home as the foundation for Charlestown's streets. From then on, properties began to sprout up in the area one by one. The Pink House, then a tavern, was one of these properties and remains one of the oldest buildings in all of Charleston. Built with only one room on each of its levels, the Pink House in the 18th century was a common enough sized place with overly large fireplaces for heat in the winter months and cooking all year round. Interestingly enough, while the first floor was and is 13 feet by 13 feet, the 3rd floor's walls slant in slightly. Most colonial Charleston homes have an outdoor kitchen dependency, though none has ever been discovered in the Pink House. As for why it's called the Pink House, well, that's because it really was pink. John Breton used Bermuda stone for the property, also known as West Indian coral stone. It nevertheless consists of a pretty pink hue. Such stone was put on ships and brought into Charlestown with the hopes of using for cobblestones. But quite quickly, the Charlestonians realized that the rounded ballast stones made better pathways, and the Bermuda stone was perfect for building. Today, the Pink House has been painted a color to match its namesake, though the original blush Bermuda stone rests directly below, a true testament to its strength and endurance despite its 3 centuries of life. While the Pink House's neighborhood may not be classically nicknamed the French Quarter, it went by something completely different in the 18th and 19th centuries. Instead, it was called Lodge Alley, or, more frequently, Mulatto Alley. In the building's earliest days, the Pink House functioned as a grocery or coffee house and a tavern for sailors coming through the area. By the early 1700s, Charleston had become the 4th busiest port in the colonies. Sailors flooded the area, and almost all made the short, easy trek to Mulatto Alley. At the time, the cobblestone streets mainly housed bordellos, taverns, or a mix of the two. The Pink House was no different. Sailors in particular visited with the hopes of satisfying the 3 W's: whiskey, wenches, and wittles, or food. Contemporary city officials of the 19th century mockingly would laugh over their nocturnal adventures in Mulatto Alley. Depending on your perspective, the 10-foot wide pathway either offered freedom at a personal cost or just another form of slavery. Most of the establishments belonged to slave owners, and they offered only enslaved or free women of color to their clientele. According to historian Cynthia M. Kennedy, in Charleston, the distinction between housekeeper and concubine blurred. So, when enslaved and free women of color assumed positions as housekeepers, most understood the role to include sex and expected to derive material rewards for the extra services. Some brothel owners forced their slaves to offer sexual services in their bordellos, where the upper floor was almost always exclusively held for sexual activity. Some of the women who worked in the bordellos, including the Pink House, chose the lifestyle as it afforded them material gains to better their lives as well as their family's life. Records show that Thomas Coker owned the Pink House during the 1750s, but by the early 19th century, Mulatto Alley had declined into all-out bawdiness. Thomas Elf, a furniture maker who lived nearby, wrote to the city council in 1800 about the fights and noise emanating from the taverns. When neighbors like Elf issued complaints, owners like Coker were only ever charged with creating a common nuisance. Charleston's unofficial red light district would not begin to fade away until the latter half of the 19th century. The Pink House deteriorated along with the time lapse. From the late 1800s until the 1930s, the Pink House sat almost completely dormant with disuse. It wasn't until Mr. and Mrs. Victor Morowitz stepped in that things began to finally turn around for the historic building. This couple hailed from New York and had recently restored nearby Fenwick Hall as well, and had made a name for themselves in buying blighted properties and restoring them to their prime. It was the Morowitz couple who added a small wing on the southwest side of the building and who brought life and vitality back within the Pink House's walls. When 1946 rolled around, a Harry McInvale Jr. bought the property and opened a small publishing house. For years, McInvale welcomed artists of all modalities to the Pink House. He hosted exhibitions and art shows and fully supported the Charleston art scene. When McInvale Jr. parted with the Pink House, it went on to another local artist, Charleston's most famous painter, Alice Ravel Huger Smith. The Pink House was then converted into her art studio, and she too hosted various exhibitions at the property. It was during this period that the Pink House also was the home base for the group Piping and Marching Society of Lower Chalmers Street. Started by a group of World War II vets who used the meeting location as a place to talk philosophy, drink good beer, and give presentations to their fellow members. It wasn't uncommon to see members of the Piping and Marching Society strolling the French Quarter District, bagpipes in hand, and they played for any and all who came outside to watch them parade past. The Pink House never truly lost its artistic flair. It seems that in some way or another, its link to Charleston's creative scene has been a constant since the 1940s. Following Alice Ravel Huger Smith's stay, attorney Frank H. Bailey bought the property and overhauled the place once again. While the Pink House still maintained its colonial aura, the Bailey family brought it up to par and instilled new features like electricity and telephones to its repertoire. Tours of the property were held throughout the 1950s and 60s before the structure was passed on to Mr. Bailey's daughter. Once again, it became an art gallery, and it still is to this day. It features artwork of Alice Stewart Grimsley, Nancy Wyckoff Rushing, and Detta Cutting Zimmerman. And according to a real estate ad, the last time the Pink House was listed for sale, the going price was $899,000, a lofty price for a property with tantalizing history and a ghostly lore. Ask any of the locals and they'll probably tell you that the Pink House has one or two ghosts lingering around. Sightings of apparitions popping up in photographs have been frequent occurrences throughout the years. Most commonly, the apparition spotted is that of a female figure up on the third floor. Her spirit wanders, pacing back and forth as though in waiting of something, or perhaps even someone. Those who have been lucky enough to catch a glimpse of her otherworldly form claim that she is the ghost of the female pirate Anne Bonny. Anne Bonny was born in County Cork, Ireland in 1698 as the illegitimate daughter of attorney William Cormac and his housekeeper Mary Brennan. Cormac's wife was not happy with the turn of events and promptly announced her husband's infidelity all over the village. With no reputation to speak of, William packed up his daughter and soon-to-be new wife and sailed to the New World. Charleston was the final destination, and William dug deep to build a new career out of the invisible ashes. Turns out that it worked out well, because William later purchased a plantation for his family. Unfortunately, Anne's mother, Mary, died while Anne was still in her teens, and this was about the time that Anne's natural flamboyant personality emerged. Rumor has it that Anne murdered a servant girl with a knife, and that she even caused enough damage to an older boy that he ended up in the hospital. But, in her defense, he attempted some sexual advances, and Anne properly put him in his place. But soon, Anne fell in love with a pirate named Will Bonny, no less, and tensions rose within the household. Her father argued that she was much too young, being that she was only 17, to be contemplating marriage. She married Bonny anyway, and Anne was promptly given the boot from her home. The allure of being married to a pirate faded quickly. Not, however, because the pirate life was hard for Anne, but because her husband reformed himself into an assistant to a governor. Anne was not pleased, and she fled with the help of friend Pierre, who ran a bawdy house. While she fled from William Bonny, she ended up in Calico Jack Rackham's arms, who was another pirate. Soon, he discovered that she was pregnant, and he dropped her off in Havana for the meantime. From there, Rackham finally decided to pick up his sort of wife a few months later. With her was Anne's new friend, the infamous Mary Read. While many account for their closeness for being just friends, others have inputted that they believe Mary and Anne may have been in a relationship. Life would not be kind to Anne, for their ship, the Revenge, was attacked and she and all her friends were imprisoned. The punishment for piracy in the 18th century was execution by hanging. One by one her friends perished, but she and Mary pleaded that they were both pregnant. It must have been a great sigh of relief that they realized they would not be put to death like the others. Even so, Mary ended up in a Jamaican prison where she died of yellow fever. As for Anne, her father allegedly felt pity and paid her ransom for her to return to Charlestown. Did she vanish as legend has it? Probably not. Instead, it seems that Anne soon gave birth to Rackham's child and then remarried to Joseph Burleigh in 1782. She died on April 25th, 1782 in Charleston. While it would be utterly fantastic to assume that the Pink House is haunted by Anne Bonny, the female pirate, it's also probably unlikely. There aren't any records to suggest that Anne spent any time at all at the Pink House in the 18th century, leading many to believe that the Pink House is instead haunted by someone else. Activity that goes on in the Pink House is more likely caused by multiple lost souls. Windows burst open suddenly despite the fact that no one is touching the window panes. The soft sound of footsteps climbing the 300-year-old stairs is heard often throughout the night and even during the day when employees are alone. Visitors have sworn to feel an uncomfortable sensation skittering down their spine as though someone is watching them from the stairwell. But when they glance towards the stairs, anticipating a face or a body standing there, they find it empty, leaving them to wonder if they are, in fact, actually alone. As for the female spirit who roams the third floor of the Pink House, it makes more sense that she was perhaps the spirit of one of the women who once worked at the property during its tavern bordello days. Generally speaking, brothels and taverns are some of the most haunted places in the world. With the influx of new people arriving every day, in addition to the tumultuous emotions of rowdy sailors and enticing women, taverns are prime hotspots for paranormal activity. Now, we are going to leave the haunted brothel and head over to a place that's haunted by man's best friend, Poogan's Porch. If your travels ever lead you to the beautiful historic city of Charleston, South Carolina, be sure to make your way to 72 Queen Street. Here you will find a restaurant known as Poogan's Porch. Converted from a grand Victorian home built in 1888, this establishment still maintains its southern charm of serving indulgently sweet iced tea and its specialty of chicken and waffles. This renowned restaurant retains its original knotted heart of pine floors and unique and stylish dual staircases. The screen doors still allow warm breezes to circulate through the restaurant and its iconic first and second story porches, an architectural testimony to the sophisticated elegance of Charleston in days gone by. But besides the distinctive features of this grand edifice and its mouth-watering menu, Poogan's Porch also offers a heaping helping of the unearthly. This place has been the domain of ghosts for over 100 years. The grand Victorian home that now houses Poogan's Porch was built in the year of 1888. The neighborhood which the house was built remained predominantly residential for nearly 100 years. By the time the country's bicentennial rolled around in 1976, the neighborhood had agreed to allow the house at 72 Queen to be converted into a restaurant. When 72 Queen was purchased, the previous owners left at such haste that they didn't even bother to bring their dog with them, which I personally find inexcusable. But back to the story. This wiry-haired white dog named Poogan was left behind without cause. Left behind on the porch of a house to wonder why he had been abandoned. The new owners, baffled as to why anyone would leave such a sweet dog behind themselves, decided to keep Poogan. Taken with the dog immediately, it was decided that the restaurant would be named after the pup. Another variation of the story is that Poogan was a neighborhood stray who would wander from porch to porch, always looking for his next meal. As the house at 72 Queen was being converted, Poogan began showing up on the porch to the house every day, looking for some workman's lunch. The owners began to joke that the porch did not belong to them, but to Poogan instead. Regardless of the account you choose to believe, I choose the second, Poogan was a real dog and not just some restaurant story. Poogan, for years, served in the capacity of official greeter at the restaurant, a position he held until his passing in the year of 1979. Poogan is still greatly missed by the owners and the people of Charleston as a whole, but the restaurant continues on, ensuring Poogan's lasting legacy. It's even been said if you visit Poogan's Porch today, you may catch a glimpse of a ghostly dog, a dog rumored to be the one and only Poogan. Poogan's ghost is not the only entity who's believed to haunt the restaurant. Another is the ghost of Zoe. Long before Poogan's Porch, dating back to the early 1900s, a woman named Zoe St. Armand lived at 72 Queen with her sister Elizabeth. Zoe was a local school teacher who had given up on ever finding true love. Most of the people in the neighborhood thought of Zoe as nothing more than a spinster, and her choice of clothing didn't help in disproving her reputation. She frequently was seen wearing long black dresses and thin framed glasses. Both Zoe and Elizabeth were incredibly close, preferring each other's company to the uncaring outside world. The sisters would continue to keep to themselves for decades. Sadly, in the year of 1945, Elizabeth passed away, and with Zoe's lone friend gone from her life, she became even more withdrawn. Clearly depressed, Zoe's mental health quickly began to decline. Late one night, Zoe left her house and began walking down the street, hollering out her sister's name. Neighbors came out to check on the frantic Zoe, one of whom took her to Bon Secours St. Francis Hospital. From then on out, Zoe spent the rest of her life at the hospital. When she departed, she was buried at Charleston St. Louis Cemetery. It's believed that the ghost of Zoe haunts her old home, still looking for her sister Elizabeth. Reports of spirits began popping up shortly after she died, but intensified once her residence was turned into a restaurant, which is a bit odd considering she wasn't much of a people's person while alive. Perhaps her desire to find her sister takes precedence over her phobia. Staff members and guests alike have seen her ghost wandering around the house. Some guests of the restaurant who have taken notice of Zoe had no clue she was actually a ghost. The realization that they had in a paranormal experience usually doesn't kick in until they see the photo of Zoe hanging on the wall. Others staying at the hotel located across the street from Poogan's Porch, who are unaware of the restaurant's history, have claimed to see an elderly woman in a black dress standing in front of the top floor window. On a few occasions, people who have seen Zoe in the window have called police believing that a poor woman was accidentally locked inside the restaurant and in need of help. When it comes to ghost stories, Poogan's Porch is in no short supply. The owners of Poogan's, Bobby Ball, has had her own experience with Zoe. She remembers one specific time that occurred one night when she was closing up for the evening. Bobby was in the process of setting the alarm when she was startled when one of the wooden stools suddenly was knocked over to the ground, seemingly on its own. Then the door began opening and shutting quite violently. Miss Ball isn't the only one who has had an experience at Poogan's. Her daytime chef had an encounter with Zoe as well. It was still a bit early, so the chef was making coffee. He had just poured himself a hot, fresh cup of joe when he heard a knock at the back door. It was the delivery from the produce guy. So, the chef put his cup of coffee down on his stool and went to the back to let the guy in. When he returned for his coffee, his cup had disappeared. He was baffled by this and began to question whether or not he had actually fixed a cup of coffee or just imagined doing so. It was early in the morning after all, and not everyone is 100% sound of mind in those early hours. Rather than dwelling on the oddity, the chef decided to just make another cup of coffee. Afterwards, he returned to his stool, and there it was. His original cup had reappeared, right in the same spot he had first placed it down. The only difference is that it was now empty. The chef picked it up and then noticed that it had a lipstick mark. I guess Zoe is a fan of the chef's coffee. Late one night, well after closing, a staff member was cleaning up when she began to get this unnerving sensation that someone was behind her. She looked around, but found nothing there. However, she could not shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. When she later resumed cleaning, she happened to look into a mirror and was startled. Startled for that it was not the sight of her own reflection that she saw. No, it was the face of an old woman wearing wire-thinned glasses. It was Zoe. Shortly after she spoke, the image of Zoe disappeared from the mirror. Another staff member who worked as a pastry chef, a cooking endeavor which would require her to work overnight because customers need their biscuits. Anywho, she was up doing her baking while listening to her favorite jams on the radio when she began to hear quite a ruckus upstairs. A ruckus so loud it actually outnoised her radio. The pastry chef was curious of how this could be, as she was the only one there. Was she scared? Yes, but nonetheless she decided to venture upstairs to see what in the world was actually going on. Once she reached the top floor, she took a deep breath and began to explore. She searched every inch of the upstairs but found nothing. Nothing at least that could have caused the loud noises that she had previously heard. So, after being unable to find the source of the ruckus, she returned to the kitchen and resumed baking all the goods. After a bit, she decided to turn the radio back on. A few songs later, one of her favorite songs came on, and thus she began singing along. Then, she suddenly started to hear another voice, a voice singing right along with her. She turned around expecting to find one of her co-workers possibly playing a trick on her this whole time, but no one was there, and the alarm had been set, so it was not possible for anyone who didn't work for the restaurant to enter unannounced, since only staff members knew the code. This time, she searched the entire restaurant, but she could not find anything out of the ordinary. The only conclusion that she could come to is that she had become the latest staff member to have an experience with the ghost of Zoe. A woman ironically named Elizabeth had an experience at the restaurant as well. Her friends had asked her where she wanted to go for her birthday dinner. Since they were going on a ghost tour afterwards, she wanted to pick a spot that was rumored to be haunted. Where? Poogan's Porch, of course. She had heard that Poogan was supposedly haunted by the ghost of spinster Zoe and wanted to check out the house-turned-restaurant for herself. After they dined on some of Poogan's famous southern cuisine, Elizabeth broke out her Ghost Radar app on her phone in search of a spooky vibe. Elizabeth claimed that there were energy spots all around her and her friends, and began to feel unnerved. The server took notice of Elizabeth's ghost app and proceeded to tell them of the eerie tale about an orb she had encountered in the corner where the group of friends were dining. Now, Poogan's is open 7 days a week and offers a Norman Rockwell setting. Over the years, Poogan's has been the site of family breakfasts, young couples enjoying the brunch hour, and business-related lunch meetings. But remember, when you are eating your southern cuisine, to keep an eye out for the ghost of Poogan. Some guests have claimed to have felt the furry spirit brush against their legs as Poogan searches for table scraps. Also, be sure to keep that other eye out for Zoe, as she may start chatting you up in the bathroom, if you're a lady. If she's not in a chatty mood, then drink your coffee quickly, otherwise she may just finish it off for you. From the historical brothel to a haunted southern-style restaurant, I will end our trip to haunted Charleston with a park where history comes alive. White Point Garden. The White Point Gardens of Charleston, South Carolina, a palatial host to various Civil War memorials and monuments, is renowned for its once blood-soaked grassy knolls and paths. According to legend, a walk beneath the oaks caressed in Spanish lace will lead only into the menacing shadows of war, and the spirits of Civil War soldiers remain at the ready to greet you with their battle cries of yesteryear. And also according to legend, so too do the souls of 29 pirates, led by the infamous Stede Bonnet. He and his crew were put to death in 1718 by hanging for the crime of piracy, and remain in waiting for their spectral ship. In 1670, 93 passengers aboard the Carolina sailed into what is now known as Charleston Harbor. Thanks to the ship's captain, who had joined an earlier expedition to Charlestown, they knew exactly where to direct the ship. Up the mighty River Ashley, named after one of the colony's Lord Proprietors, Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper, and to the sharp-pointed peninsula, the captain steered the ship. Originally, the indigenous population had called the river Kiowa, which is now the name given to a barrier island outside of the city. The Spanish called it San Jorge. By the era of the English colonists, Ashley was the name for the river, and Oyster Point, or White Point, for the jutting peninsula itself. White Point accurately described the rocky land since sun-bleached oyster shells littered the soil. The colony's first governor, Colonel William Sale, deemed that the land opposite the peninsula was the perfect place for granting land to the town's first settlers. Sale confessed to Lord Ashley Cooper in a written letter, "It is as it were a key to open and shut this settlement into safety or danger." He immediately began granting citizens land, but by 1679 realized that White Point was more suited for building a town. For almost a century of colonization, White Point Garden remained a peninsula of shanties and shacks and modest homes. On September 14th and 15th of 1752, however, a raging hurricane swept through Charleston Harbor. The Preservation Society of Charleston claims that the force of the strong winds began the evening of 1714, becoming more violent as the storm blew closer. Rain sluiced down steadily through the early morning, and a terrifying night gave way to a horrifying day. The protecting seawalls of White Point had cracked, allowing water to rush through its broken walls into the city. By 11 a.m., all the ships floating in the harbor had found themselves washed up on the shores. Water levels rose so high that the townspeople panicked and climbed to the upper floors of their homes and allegedly contemplated taking their own lives to avoid the fate of drowning. Records show that the hurricane greatly diminished the population of Charlestown, and not 2 weeks later, another strong hurricane depleted their crop supply. The eastern seawall of the White Port was rebuilt with palmetto logs, which would hold strong until 1804 under the force of another hurricane. Then the city decided to use sturdy ballast stones instead. For nearly a decade, White Point Garden became a highly sought-out spot for outdoor performances. That is, until the War of 1812, when the British blockaded Charleston Harbor. 15 large guns or cannons were stationed around the perimeter of White Point, pointing at the battery just across the way. For the length of the American Revolution and the War of 1812, Fort Wilkins occupied White Point, which was then Oyster Point. The War of 1812 was the least of White Point's worries, however. Citizens watched in horror as the first shots of the Civil War rang out at Fort Sumter, just across the way from White Point Garden. Gunfire ripped through the streets, destroying stately grand homes along the battery. Not to be downtrodden, homeowners simply built more outrageously big homes on the strip instead. With the threat of ongoing war hanging above their heads, the city of Charleston moved into action. They placed heavy fortifications around the city's limits, including along the outer banks of White Point, including columbiads, which were the largest sized cannons in use at that time. Today, a few of those columbiads remain at White Point, though the war between the states has been over for over a century. From the very beginning, White Point has been a location that alternates between the deadly and the tranquil. Between the years of 1840 and 1881, a public bathing house stood at the end of King Street. Built by James English, William Patton, and Henry L. Pinckney for approximately $25,000, the bathhouse was a favorite spot for Charlestonians. The cake and ice cream parlor on the top floor only added to its allure. Years spent enjoying its existence came to an end in the 1880s when a hurricane after hurricane ripped through the Charleston Harbor. Although the city restored each time, by 1881 the bathhouse finally shut its doors for good. The waterway was filled in after that, and White Point officially became recognized as a garden. Still, the outdoor concerts carried on with much gusto. In 1906, Mrs. Martha W. Carrington had built a bandstand for her mother, Mrs. George W. Williams. White Point Garden became a place of joviality and fun until 1978, when the neighbors grew incensed with the constant racket coming from next door. Performances were then outlawed at the bandstand. When the bandstand needed upkeep in 1985, which cost $30,000, some citizens proposed bringing back the outdoor concerts. The answer to that was no, though weddings and certain special events are now allowed. There's no hiding the amount of military artifacts that can be found within White Point Garden, though no object takes a cake quite like the fake Columbiad. In the early 1900s, a British cannon from the Revolutionary War was discovered in Charleston. Some years later, in 1993, the city opted to return the cannon to White Point Garden, where it would have once sat in defense of the city. Not to be outdone, a prankster waited in the shadows ready to make his mark. He hired a local foundry to construct a fake colonial-style cannon and then submerged it in water for about 6 months. By the time he pulled it back up, the faux cannon had the same aesthetic look as the real Revolutionary cannon found some 30 years earlier. He then sold it to an antique dealer in Beaufort, South Carolina, where it was discovered for its outstanding condition and sent to Charleston. The city acquired the piece and placed it along with the original cannon. Luckily enough, the prankster had a small error. As an anonymous historian put it, the cannon fooled many people, but because the foundry did not have the tools to fabricate an actual cannon, the foundry instead poured molten metal around a section of cast iron pipe, even though cast iron pipe was not used in large cities until the 19th century. At some point, the fake cannon was stolen and was never seen again. A fitting end to a strange tale. While White Point's turbulent past of wars and hurricanes may have had a hand in making this park the haunted location that it is today, most attribute its haunting tales to the pirates who were executed here in the 18th century. Within 30 years of Charleston's official founding, piracy stamped its mark early on. As the 18th century's fourth largest port in America, Charleston was the perfect place for economic trade, both illegal and legal. But in late May of 1718, Charleston had a swashbuckling visitor it no doubt could have done without. Edward Teach, otherwise known as Blackbeard, blockaded the Charleston harbor and took over the city. He quickly commandeered one of the port's ships, the Crowley, which was already filled to the brim with highbrow citizens in London. Blackbeard subsequently sent a letter to the royal governor claiming that he would execute every single person on the Crowley if he did not receive medical supplies, which, rumor has it that these medical supplies were actually for venereal diseases. In a panic, the royal governor sent the required supplies. Blackbeard stayed true to his word. He didn't execute any of the prisoners, though he did take their valuables, money, and, yes, their clothes. Less than 2 months later, the pirates blockaded the port once more. Today, Stede Bonnet's name is nowhere near as famous as Blackbeard's. Born on the Caribbean island of Barbados to wealthy English parents, Stede Bonnet veered away from the traditional methods of becoming a pirate. Most commonly, pirates seized their ships on the ocean blue and turned the people on board either to Davy Jones under the sea or made them a part of the crew. Bonnet took the gentlemanly route, if such a thing exists. He personally funded the money for his ship, the Revenge, and even hired paid crew members. But Bonnet had no experience in being a pirate and was forced to hire someone to lead the crew. For a time, Bonnet and his men took on the Caribbean islands before sailing to the Bahamas, where he first met Blackbeard. They joined forces, and the rest, as they say, is history. Meanwhile, back in Charleston, Governor Robert Johnson of the Carolina colonies was begging the Lord Proprietors for help. The Lord Proprietors naturally ignored the plea, and Johnson scrambled to find someone to step in. That someone was William Rhett, a local merchant who had banded together other merchants of Charlestown to fight back against the piracy problem. In the waters closer to now North Carolina, Rhett and his crew uncovered Stede Bonnet and his motley men of pirates in the Cape Fear River. Bonnet attempted to stand his ground. He combined the crew members from the other ships so that they could sail as one unified force against William Rhett's 3 ships. Unfortunately, every single ship got caught on the shoreline during low tide. But while Rhett was able to free his 3 sloops, Bonnet remained stuck. Hope was not at all lost. When Rhett boarded Bonnet's ship, the pirate had a plan: to blow up the gunpowder storage and send them all up to oblivion. Bonnet's men were not with the plan. They threw up their hands and surrendered to Rhett and the merchant crew, and the whole lot of the pirates were subsequently chained up and shipped to Charlestown. 30 men, including Stede Bonnet, were promptly imprisoned in Half Moon Battery, which, as we know from earlier videos, is now the old Exchange and Provost Dungeon. But, thanks to Bonnet's prestigious heritage, he was separated from his men and jailed at the Provost Marshal. Interesting tidbit: Bonnet staged an escape from his imprisonment. He wore a dress and disguised as a woman, but didn't make it past Sullivan's Island. All of Bonnet's men were deemed guilty at trial and were summarily hanged at White Point. It's said that their bodies were left there to swing in the breeze, their faces growing bloated with heat, their skins slowly decaying as the hours turned the clock of time. When they were finally cut down, the bodies of the dead pirates were tossed into the marsh, which was later filled in with land so that homes could be built on top. Unfortunately for Bonnet, his fate was no different from his men's. While he managed to convince the jury to push back his execution date 7 times, the judge finally held stern and ordered his hanging. On December 10, 1718, Stede Bonnet was led up to the gallows at White Point. Author and historian Walter Fraser Jr. wrote, "Manacles and clutching a nosegay of wildflowers, was taken in a hurdle to the place execution near White Point, where the once bold pirate appeared terrified and near collapse. The executioner dropped the noose over his head and around his neck, and then Bonnet was swung off the cart. He died an agonizing death of strangulation, the invention of the gallows that would break the victim's neck being years away. A few days later, Bonnet's body was untied from the gallows and tossed into the marshes along with the bodies of his men. There they lay, a symbol of the popularity of piracy in the 18th century. The swarming maggots and feasting animals on their bodies were a sight that could not later be unseen. For 5 weeks in 1718, 49 pirates met their end at White Point, and it's said that their souls continue to haunt the park and the nearby Battery Park to this day. Visitors have witnessed anonymous faces peering back at them from within the trees, and a number of reports have surfaced about a manifestation of an apparition hanging from the old oak trees. Terrifying screams echo in the midnight air, and legend has it that when people stand near Water Street and glance down, they can still spot the faces of the executed pirates staring back at them from the water's surface. So that includes the final week of Stormi Tells Ghost Stories Haunted Charleston on my Girls Rock Productions channel. I hope you enjoyed hearing some of the dark stories about this charming little southern town on the port, visiting the Pink House, Poogan's Porch, and White Point Garden. Remember to like this video and subscribe to my Girls Rock Productions channel. And while you're here, check out some of my other playlists. On Stormi Teaches Music, which I will be starting up again shortly, once I am able to get my guitar restrung. Again, my daughter broke my restringing tool, so it's taking some time. What I do on that playlist, I do live covers and guitar lessons on Mondays and Wednesdays at 11 p.m. Eastern. And I will start that back up on the first Wednesday with the live lesson of Almost Lover by A Fine Frenzy. After that, it will resume to the covers being on Monday, and the lesson for the song covered will be taught on Wednesday. I also have started up my Stormi Talks True Crime playlist, where I talk about some of the most notorious and controversial crimes in all of history. Those new videos are posted Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern. If you are ever in the Wilmington, North Carolina area, sign up for the Wilmington Ghosts Walking Tour or the Wilmington Spirits and Spirits Pub Crawl with U.S. Ghost Adventures. You can have me or one of our other talented guides show you around our historic downtown and hear some of the darkest stories the beautiful city on the beach has to offer. While you are visiting, if you decide you want to stay or buy a vacation home, check out my Moving to Coastal Carolina channel and contact me, as I am a licensed realtor in the southeastern North Carolina area. Tune in next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Eastern to find out the next city I will be talking about. Until then, have a great week and be safe.